Olá, bom dia, boa tarde, boa noite a todos, todas e todos. Eu me chamo William de Castro, eu sou pesquisador mestrando do POSAFRO-UFBA e curador do Museu Afrodigital da Memória Africana e Afro-Brasileira. Eu estou aqui para saudar a todos nesta sessão do segundo ciclo de lives da 21ª Escola Doutoral Fábrica de Ideias. Essa escola intensiva que é anualmente marcada no calendário de pesquisadoras brasileiras, de brasileiros de países africanos e do mundo todo. Essa edição acontece sempre às terças e quintas, às 10 horas, do horário de Brasília, contando com mais de 30 professores de doutoramento de diferentes partes do mundo. Fábrica de Ideias realiza esse evento em parceria com o Programa de Pós-Graduação em Estudos Étnicos e Africanos da Universidade Federal da Bahia, os programas de pós-graduação em Antropologia da Universidade Federal da Bahia e da Universidade Estadual de Campinas, o programa de pós-graduação em Políticas Públicas da Universidade Federal do Maranhão e o Africa Multiple Cluster of Excellence da Universidade de Bayreuth. Assim como toda a equipe de realização do Fábrica, muito obrigada. Contamos com o apoio da Universidade.
We count on the University of Cape Verde and the directorship of the Federal University of Bahia, the Association for Anthropology Research, the National Association for Graduate Studies in Social Sciences, the Brazilian Associations of Political Sciences, and the Brazilian Association of Sociology. This event is made possible by the HS9 and translated by Raquel Luciana de Souza. To all involved, thank you very much. And thank you also for those who are watching us for sharing your time with us. I would like to inform you that it's necessary to have your presence in 75% of the attendance for this course. We will be paying attention to the chat box for questions. This is what we seek to do, is to think together about this theme. So please allow generalizations in so that we can have real exchanges and think about these complex issues. Today we have the theme, the world post-pandemics, that is going to be taught by Professor Dr. Rosana Machado and Cristina Marin, and will be debated by Professor EnocentMsindo. I would like to thank you for your presence. Professor Innocent, can you hear me?
Yes, I hear you.
I suggest that you close your microphone just to avoid any problems with the sounds. Thank you. So now I'm going to introduce Professor Pinheiro Machado. She is a professor of international studies at the University of Bayreuth. She is a fellow of the academic in the United Kingdom, and she's the main researcher for the global project, No Longer Middle Class, which is developed among 4 institutions in 4 different countries. She's been a professor of international development at Oxford. She's been a researcher at Harvard University, and she's got a degree in social sciences by UFBA and her doctoral degree in social anthropology. And she's got a scholarship by the Venegrin Foundation in the College of London. She also had a training, and she's considered one of the pioneers of translating fieldwork in the Popular Republic of China. She's got several publications, and her degree is based on observing a global chain of merchandise purchasing between China and the rest of the globe. She's won a Ford Foundation Human Rights Award, Great Prize Cups. She's authored 7 books, and her references has been reflecting about modernity and development, particularly in the context of risks. She's the author and organizer of 7 books. Tomorrow Will Be Greater. She analyzes the Brazilian crisis and the ascension of the extreme rights and our possible routes. I also would like to add that she teaches a course about academic writing that is available online. Welcome, Rosana, and thank you for being here with us. So I think, thank you, William, for your introduction, your detailed introduction. I would like to state that I think they have requested that cameras are closed down, Professor Misindo. So this is what maintains us alive during this hard times, such tragic times for us and our families and the families of many of participants who are here attending today and participating the Factory of Ideas. And at the same time, we are here resisting and collaborating and exchanging through ideas. We continue and we persist. I would like to thank you, Livio and Omar, for this invitation. It's the second time that I joined the Factory of Ideas. Please invite me every year, preferably personally in Salvador, because Factory of Ideas is this institution in Brazilian academia that we has trained so many students all over the world and that has been developing decolonial work before these colonial notions have been uh, become so big in academia, in international academia. Great admiration. I also would like to thank for the work of Raquel, who does incredible work in all of the Fábrica de Ideias, William for his introduction, and Professor for Livio for the comments. And I would like to salute everybody who's watching us on YouTube. Today I'm going to introduce a project along with my colleague Christina Marin, and she introduced me first. So I would like to request that I introduce her, because this is a work that we are developing in partnership, and we are not planning to speak separately, but together. That's how we've been working. So Christina, she's a postdoc she's an anthropologist. She's got a doctoral degree in anthropology, and she's been working with platforms. She's published a book about her master's dissertations, which is about weddings, and her doctoral work is dealing with issues about platforms and uh, wedding pictures. And she's now a postdoc fellow at the Bar University, and we've been working together in several projects, and one of them is the one I'm introducing now, but also about authoritarianism, platformization in the global south. So I took the liberty of introducing her, because when we introduce the slides, she's going to turn on the camera and we are going to speak together, if you allow me. What we are going to do today, when Livio came to invite me and he heard that I was studying the post-pandemic world, I don't think it is extremely inspiring, and it has encouraging. So this is where you're going to talk about your project. So what we are going to do is what we are going to do. We have very preliminary results, but it's a presentation, basically preliminary presentation. We stopped the data collection now, and we haven't started the analysis yet. So what we are doing here is to present the general outcomes of what we're doing. I'm going to share the slides here.
Se para vocês não for problema. Vocês conseguem ver já meus slides?
Can you see my slides?
Estou tentando, como sempre, o computador sempre dá uma leve demorada antes de começar.
Before.
Ok. Então, o título dessa pesquisa é O Mundo
So the title of this research is The World Post-Pandemics, organized by me and Christina Marin, and we've been doing this for 1 year. We started exactly in the beginning of the pandemics. The best way of explaining it, where does this research come from, is to look at the motivations. We start this research in the beginning of the pandemics, when there was this big concern that everybody wanted to know more or less where the world was going. And it starts, we realize, in the first weeks of lockdown. We didn't even use this terminology lockdown, because during the first 10 days in which the OMS, the WHO declares the global pandemic, the narratives of the great thinkers of the world, and I'm talking about males here, and researchers who start to take over space in global media, writing books very quickly in order to have this exercise about the world will be better or worse in the future. And then we see some positions that are polarized, antagonic, or rather, in which we see, on one hand, the optimists of the pandemics, people like Amartya Sen, whose work is marked by optimism that is contagious. And he talks, for example, at the Financial Times, that a better society was emerging from solidarity, a solidarity that was always emerges out of great tragedies. And on the other hand, we have other philosophers and researchers that who claim that a society that is going to be much more if it's going to turn into more selfish, more unequal. We clearly start then with this boom of narratives and visions that in which we imagine how this world is going to be. I'm talking about philosophers, but that expands to all over the new genre, mediatic genre, and that emerge in a pandemic world about the post-pandemic world. So this is going to be a moment in which previsions start to explode in the media. So what did we decide to do? We started to see that there was this dispute about this future, these narratives about how this future, post-pandemic future, was going to be. And we decided to have a systematic research about what was being said in the post-pandemic world. So we separated some categories, so the post-pandemic world, post-COVID world, post-pandemic world, the world post-coronavirus, and we established in a few weeks some keywords that could identify these narratives. And then from we collected then 7,000 subjects using a software of searching, a search software, and then we working with automatization. We then organized over 300 subject matters that we filtered, and now our database, complete databases, and read, not analyzed and categorized though, quickly, 2,300 subjects that have been collected so far, and we decided that we were going to use those symbolic 100 days. First 100 days. We used then this landmark in March, and we analyzed this 100 days of the presidency of the Republic, etc. We had this, because after 100 days, it starts to be repetitious, but in these 100 days, the amount of subjects in the whole world is going to be extraordinary. We are going to have The Economist, some of the most important magazines in the world, and making special concessions, talking about the world post-COVID. This genre becomes prevailing in the media, which we are going to call mainstream media or hegemonic media. And we have selected, we wanted to study what's being said, and what we know is a form of power, of directing, of trying to direct this future. And from this standpoint, we selected the countries of the G7 because we wanted to see these hegemonic discourses about that, and emerging economies such as India, Brazil, and the BRICS, including the emerging economies. This research was developed in 5 languages. We chose the newspapers from, we worked with over 50 newspapers, and the choices of written media was developed through diverse methodologies that we analyzed. Some reports, both by BBC as well as the Reuters, that is launched by the Oxford University every year, and the main countries were around 7 countries per 7 newspapers per country. And in this circuit, we had the search, manual search, and then we came to this number of cataloged subjects and registered subjects. Our restlessness in the beginning starts with this notion that many stated that this was futurology. We actually write about that, and we write about this first presentation. But for those who are interested in reading, Christina and I have published a preliminary version of this research at the POE magazine, and many of the participants had access to this text. But if you want to type up our names on Google, you're going to find the text. The notion, many said that when we were debating the articles, that why are you studying this futurology, this genre that newspapers enjoy so much, but for us in the social sciences in particular, but academics in the social sciences in general, we know at least but I think it's important to state more or less how this is located. From Foucault, we know that what is said and authorized, who can said and how it is said, it is a form of power. Discourse is not only words, it's practice. Discourse is a way of how social structures and how social norms authorize us to say things in a particular way and think in a particular way. And then we realized that this new genre that was exploding in the media was a moment, a singular moment, in order to understand processes of social transformation that could or could not be accelerated. Everything we're going to say here is an exercise of futurology, but we don't want to think about that as an exercise in which we are just playing how to imagine the future, but we think that imagining the future is going to be created by white males in spaces of power, in institutions that have power, such as the World Bank and the World Economic Forum that starts to support, for example, basic income. How these institutions and the world of power through hegemonic traditional media starts to imagine this world, and as they do, it's from a perspective of a discourse, a world that is being created. It doesn't mean that, well, now the masseuse spaces where Japanese go are no longer going to exist, and the domestic economy is going to be more democratic. That doesn't mean it's going to happen, but when we think about this large body of futurology, if you will, in this large body of materials that is our imagination, this works, we may realize that
exercer o poder e de exercer o futuro é um exercício de poder, mostrando, né, de como que esse futuro está sendo criado aqui e agora. E é um momento, todos os momentos de crise antropologicamente são momentos sempre muito efervescentes, de símbolos, né, que ficam muito efervescentes. A gente estava naquele período de 100 dias da pandemia, que é um momento de limbo, de transição, e na literatura de desenvolvimento internacional hoje a gente ainda trabalha muito com a ideia, a partir de discurso do Foucault, a ideia de discursos de transição, que nesses momentos políticos sempre emergem discursos disputados sobre transição, isso serve, né, tanto para o poder hegemônico quanto para os alternativos.
For hegemonic discourses about climate change and futures that may be disputed. Then we were collecting all of these categories about what within this category, the world post-COVID, we cataloged what was being disputed, and then we worked with notions such as leisure, consumption, lifestyle, and work. And now we are going to present this text. We are also thinking about by whom these ideas are shared and where are they coming from. I have already stated that they come from.
Mas por quem a gente não avançou nessa pesquisa ainda? A gente ainda está na pesquisa do que está sendo dito.
And this research has to do with what's being said, but the next step for this research is to confirm a hypothesis that we have that this future is being disputed by white males from hegemonic countries and hegemonic institutions. The subject matters may be written by women and men, but when we're talking about the articles and opinions, it's predominantly but we may not make that assertion yet because we haven't had our quantitative analysis, but we realize that the predominance of white males talking about how this world is going to be and imagining it. So this imagination, this desire, this way through which the world is going to be imagined, who has the right to imagine this future and who has the right or who's authorized to speak about how this world, this future is going to take place. So when we talk about the future, about white males of hegemonic countries, we conclude that the world remains the same with a few changes for the worse or for the better, but this is not our role here. We are trying to organize a few directions. What we know going into this subject matter of is that changes do not occur as we know. The majority of us have training in social sciences and human science. Changes do not occur in a process of long transformation. The process of transformation rarely occurs in a short period of time. There is a broad space and decades and years and centuries. And we also know that great events change our notions of privacy, of intimacy, our relationship with body and space. So all of that we see the anguish of times in which how our intimacies and our privacy, how our bodies and our time, how these things are entangled in the process. We know that in these large events, thinking about the emergency of the bourgeoisie and tuberculosis that is going to change the way through which people interact. People had broader windows after tuberculosis, how these big pandemics and these circumstances change. Human sciences and classic social sciences will change our bodies, our relationships with intimacy and our bodies. We know that modernity then is built separating this sphere from the public to the private. And we know that this pandemics intensify some social cultural changes that are brought to modernity through capitalism, but particularly through technology. Then COVID invents a few things in these pandemics, but in some ways it's going to accelerate changes that were ongoing through technological revolutions. So in some ways it's going to be an intensifier of times of something that was already ongoing. It's something that we say when we are debating this theme. It's also going to create new things. I remember that when we wrote the article, many people said, why are you writing this? Because in 10 days, the pandemic is going to change. And now we've been in lockdown for 1 year. And the positive outcome could be that we are going to be in this state for another year, taking the best precautions. So in the best hypothesis, 1 year, perhaps we are moving towards the living this on a global sphere. But the fact is that it's possible that many of these dystopic scenarios are going to emerge in its concrete forms. We already see some of these issues in England. Many traces of these changes are already taking place, social changes. Usually the great changes, they occur over many years and they are very small. The processes of transformation, long-term transformation. And we know I'm bringing here three classes of our areas of our field. We are once again talking about social distancing. It was great to go back to Elias because we found out his text that talks about social distancing as a process that marks modernity. It's a specific article talk called Social Distancing, in which he talks about this process, the distancing and the distances through among between bodies is a characteristic trait of modernity. We know that in sociological studies and historical processes that this process of social distancing and avoidance is a process that constitutes modernity. And it's very interesting to see how he talks specifically about this category of social distancing. In Foucault, we talk about vigilance because we know that this process of hygiene brings this notion, and it's important that I have this app and I state where I am because then we may have control of the pandemics, but we understand what that means in terms of control and biopolitics and a society that of the surveillance. And the pandemics is also an opportunity to accelerate this process of surveillance. And we also go back to the classic habits and inequalities, then a lot of this world that is going to be consumed post-COVID world becomes not only a security measure, but also a measure for extinction and aspects, distinctive aspects of what I am going to consume, what I'm going to, how I'm going to relate, who may position their bodies in a particular way, who may consume certain types of things, who may have a home office, and these are sanitary measures. Those who defend science and vaccines. We also see the contradictions in this process. So I believe that all of that has been a very interesting process in thinking about social transformation, and I'm going to think about three areas: mind, body, and work. We have 10 categories, but we have selected three here. The first has been the transformations of the body, and we are going to start to talk about what we have found in this universe. And we now want to depart from this dystopic notion in which how this post-COVID world is imagined. And of course, once again, the techniques of the body, going back to the classics, this is a great work because after many years, we should go back to the classics as foundational work. It's been interesting, and in that sense, we've been going back to this issue of Van Gogh because all that Van Gogh lists, all of them have been profoundly affected by the pandemics, and I would like to hear the reality of Mozambique, the funerals in Mozambique. I would like to hear all of you because we are going, if Van Gogh stated that these rituals were moments of a profusion of symbols through aggregation, now we have these moments that are grounded on the opposite. It is the opposite principle in which the nobody, the process of social emptying, then become fundamental in the pandemic process. So, as Van Gogh stated, in reasserting that the wife then becomes the mother, these roles of reassertion, of entry for women and the husband. And I'm talking about theory in the 19th century, but how this social approval is fundamental. In a rite of passage of death, how is this going to be emptied? And this is already a theme that are going to be, but first we have fallen into the trap of stating, oh, how difficult it is to understand these rites of passage without social gatherings. What our condition, human conditions, allows us to do in terms of rites of passage, but we also realize that these rites actually they are mediatic. They become mediatic. Online weddings, online funerals. Then we know that there is a tendency in body changes in which that I remember that it's now become fashionable to have namaste as a way of saluting. The correct way of the people who talk about etiquette, how to dress, how to act. These etiquette influencers, they start talking about what is correct to do during the pandemics. Namaste is very cool, but in England, for example, everybody is used to elbowing each other. In England, that's not already common. I don't know if I'm going to be using my arm, but elbowing people, and how much that then changes. And with that, I'm not stating that these changes are going to happen, but what we may state is that small changes over a process of 1 or 2 years of pandemic certainly will have body changes in terms of we believe that in some sectors of the population, we are going to observe body changes and probably more social distancing. So the joke in the United Kingdom is that the anxiety of shaking hands or not is being resolved. Now you just elbow each other and we get rid of the anxiety of kissing or hugging. So there's so many subjects now talking about how to shake hands. And the joke is now that lockdown has been liberated, the rule is please hug carefully. And then there are many rules about how to hug. And there are several then subject matter saying hug carefully, only hug this person and that person. Very serious subject, newspapers, articles, which is very curious, particularly I'm using national stereotypes. So sometimes we are not able to, we see so many etiquettes in terms of newspapers and companies. We want to talk about this new relationship with the body that is marked by this new market and the emergence of new markets. But the debate about is people debating what can you drink in a camera, because you should drink you only have 2 drinks. You should not get drunk because the microphone is going to move around here and there. And so all of these rules about how to behave at a funeral, you turn off your mic, and depending on the funeral, you're going to deal with people who are not used to using computers and all of this in online platforms and these rituals. rites of passage. So the second point is the presentation of itself. Now I'm using something that is more descriptive. The industry of suits, the Financial Times and Wall Street Journal, which are newspapers that are going to be dealing with these issues in the world, but great corporations were very anxious about the industry of alfaiates. Some people writing, it's not the end of suits, it's the end of suits. Because many subject matters talking about the crux were going to be the shoes for the pandemics. And of course, we are not being naive here because we may imagine that these corporations, they are funding these subjects because it's about power. It's a dispute of market and powers, and many subjects about this presentation of oneself between the public and the private. From the waist up, I'm in the public sphere, dressed accordingly and professionally. From the waist down, perhaps I'm just wearing pantufas, as in this picture. Of course, that's not my case. No, I'm here wearing skirts and shoes and whatnot. Many articles also talking about the domestic space. Some Japanese articles, they state that, well, men now cannot go to masseuse homes anymore, and they might go home and they're gonna have spend more time at home and more division of domestic tasks. But in this debate of the post-pandemic world, but in the concrete debate of the pandemic world, what we see is consolidated numbers and consolidated theories in terms of both increase of domestic violence as well as much as the double or triple domestic journeys, domestic tests. So then we see so many of you may see what we're seeing here in your relationships. So people are finding out how to plant their own food and cooking their own food, looking for healthier lifestyles. But the tendency is that people go back to cooking, many people buying plants and having a quote unquote a return to a healthier world during the pandemics. And many articles talking about the specific subject matters of chiefs and cook for yourself tutorials. These strong notions of social isolation. In services, here we have an image of restaurants separated by bubbles that is completely dystopic. The eco bubble that is like a small spaceship in which people could travel. It was already produced, but many people stated, well, this is an opportunity for these eco bubbles and that I'll take my capsule. And my capsule becomes this, can may be adapted to a tent or a type of a cabin. Motorhomes, many matters, many articles about motorhomes in the first few days of the pandemic, stating that you no longer needed to travel by plane, and alongside with that, you're going to have people responding to the media new businesses are opening of people who are buying vans and adapting them in order to rent them. Restaurants, that is very dystopic, but we see several restaurants in Europe that are shaped that way. Debates about flights, that the world was going to travel, fly less. And all of these debates that when a class takes a step back, the intellectual elites, when they take a step back, they travel less because of the production of carbon dioxide, and it's because it's dangerous. During the pandemic, they don't eat meat because it's an environmental issue. And when we see that, we also realize that the contradiction in this process, that while part of the world starts to eat meat, part of the elites start to stop eating meat. When the emerging countries start to have access to the right to airports and traveling, there's also a reorganization that no, now we are going to travel with our eco capsules. It's a notion. Travel trips, fake trips that in which you buy filters so that you can show on Instagram that you have your foxcation. Notion also is about new cities and how the cities are going to be in the future, and then we may go back to this issue, but since we are running out of time, there's many debates about surfaces and spaces. So what are the good materials that kill bacteria and aluminum and surfaces? And we know that it's not about surfaces, it's about ventilation. And Brasilia was considered at Le Figaro, in which they were debating some cities that were in the avant-garde of what a post-COVID city in Brasilia, the architecture. It was features an example of a city that had a lot of space and public spaces and areas and social distancing, a city that it has been designed by the modernist movement, and how it becomes a pro-COVID city. And now I'm going to invite my colleague Cristina Martins, who is going to talk about the theme, her specialty, work. First, I would like to thank you. I would like to ask you that I have realized that you are the one who has our final presentation. We organized it together. So I'm going to have your luxurious assistance sharing the slides. And also, before proceeding, I would like to thank the organizers for this event. The Factory of Ideas is being organized in very adverse conditions. Professor Misindo, it's a pleasure to know you through teleconference. And finally, I would like to thank Professor Raquel for her translation. I've been introduced by Rosana, so I'm not going to go through, but quickly, I know some people joined later. Christina Marin is my name. I'm an anthropologist. I am linked to the Federal University of Fluminense University, where I had my doctoral degree. And currently, I am at the University of Bath as a visiting professor. I've been researching the issue of work and transformations in the world of work. So when we get in this pandemic state, I already have an eye geared towards transformation. So I was very happy when I was invited to present this work. So following up on what we presented, what we have collected rather, before showing what's emerged, what am I going to do? What I'm going to do is to deal with the projections of the post-COVID world in terms of work. But before, I'm going to deal with what is the approach, the broad approach that we are presenting. Next slide. As an anthropologist, we know what is work. The answer is going to depend on certain specific social circumstances. What is considered work in Brazil in 2021 might not be considered in 2010. In certain social groups, something is considered work, in others it's not. As anthropologists, we know that there are hegemonic representations of what's considered work. And Rosana, if you could, this is an exercise that we do quickly, and of course, it has illustrative value more than scientific in that sense, but this has been a search that I have done when I set up the presentation in a search engine. But what I've done was to type the word worker in English, trabalhador, but in English we don't have this gender mark. So I just typed up worker, and what is interesting is the association that is more immediate and a majority that takes place to a predominantly male space linked to civil work. So what is represented in the mechanisms, the search mechanism for us? But what we are going to do here in a more broadening scope, in the next slide, we are going to have domestic work, but I would like to advance the work by Andrea Confloy, who presents an overview of the 1,000 years of work and paid work and organized work in the Fabrica. They live and they work a lot, and they escape this hegemonic model, if you will. Hence, what has drawn our attention is how these projections for traditional work also present antagonism in terms of domestic work. Can we have the next slide, please? Here we have two examples I see here on my left-hand side Professor Landerwearing. It's a very interesting presentation. El País has had this dossier, The Future After Coronavirus. We are going to have a projection in which domestic work are shared domestic work is shared.
matéria que eu trouxe, e essa, sim, muito representativa, assim, ela é muito recorrente, do jornal japonês The Asahi Shimbun, não falo japonês, mas essa é a minha tentativa de ler, já indicando que havia uma expectativa de mulheres abandonar as carreiras para dar conta de uma casa que continua funcionando durante a pandemia, né? Foi uma experiência compartilhada por muitos de nós, escolas que deixaram de funcionar e o cuidado das crianças, da casa, da comida, né? E uma casa que funciona de uma maneira diferente, porque as crianças... A gente não tem mais uma estrutura, os casais estão está todo mundo dentro de casa, tem uma comida que vai ser preparada várias vezes por dia, e aí muitas projeções de que isso atrasaria as carreiras de mulheres, ou que a gente perderia muitos anos de conquistas, né? Rosana, você pode passar, por favor? A outro tipo de reportagem, de projeção muito, mas muito frequente, diz respeito à arquitetura de novos escritórios. E foi bastante interessante retomar, assim, é claro que montando uma apresentação eu queria trazer algumas imagens, mas como uma parte muito grande dessas reportagens apontavam para escritórios muito modernos, com tecnologias que evitassem toque, então controle de voz, leitura de retina, por exemplo, para, ao invés de digitar códigos, né, na entrada de um edifício, digamos, você tem um controle de retina, que aliás, é uma tecnologia que já tem sido testada e usada em algumas situações, espaços muito amplos para circulação, e a ideia de que as baias, né, porque os escritórios projetados nas últimas décadas, eles são salas muito grandes que reúnem muitas pessoas em baias, ou seja, do ponto de vista sanitário, tudo que você não faz, né, colocar um monte de gente numa sala que é fechada, que mais? Estações de limpeza, então, assim, e vários, eu acho que vai aparecer no slide seguinte, Rosana, passa, por favor. Isso. Algumas projeções, e aí, claro, já apareciam escritórios de arquitetura apresentando esses projetos de espaços abertos, o que é particularmente curioso no norte, né? A gente que está aqui no norte agora não consegue muito imaginar, a gente está no inverno nada, a gente está quase no verão europeu, com 10 graus e um vento de 50 quilômetros por hora ali fora, mas enfim, esses espaços estavam sendo projetados, muitos verdes, janelas abertas e espaços amplos. Próximo slide, por favor. Mas aí a pergunta que seguia, ou pelo menos que se apresentava também em numerosas reportagens, era, mas e os escritórios, eles vão continuar existindo no mundo pós-Covid? Pode passar, por favor. E a resposta de muitos analistas, comentaristas e repórteres era não vai não, a gente daqui para frente não deve voltar a trabalhar em casa, ou pelo menos não na mesma frequência, e isso vai reorganizar completamente as cidades, né? A gente não vai ter os deslocamentos diários, e a gente não vai ter mais marcada essa distinção territorial, geográfica, entre espaço do trabalho e espaço da casa, né, o do lazer, o que já é verdade para uma parte razoável
Part of a reasonable part of the population, but I also would like to draw attention to how a very important part of these projections of this world exclude others. And of course, we are talking about working in an office, and we have a large portion of society, and there's no option in terms of working remotely whatsoever. So next slide. And hence, it's also important, I would like particularly thinking about a space, as Professor Rosana has stated before, a space in which we share ideas and I have special interest in listening to you and some debates about essential, flexible, part-time, precarious workers. Next slide, please. I think that what I could do is not going to be only about that, but these are some of the debates that during this period of the pandemics, over a year, we have naturalized in some ways. It's been disseminated, not only the vocabulary in English and Portuguese, but the notion of essential worker that has become very specific at the moment. But it was a debate, above all, in which Professor David Graeber, an anthropologist, had from his text. The premise of Graeber's premise is that a large portion of the work that we do does not have any recognized value, even for those. It's work that if they vanish from the face of the world, it wouldn't make any difference, or the world could be actually better. It's a very provoking work, but it has had great repercussion. And it's had tremendous value when we needed to lock ourselves in our homes. And we started to see that we could not be locked at home. And right in the beginning of the pandemics, the platform of politics, it is a media that is not necessarily mainstream, but in the United States, the comments and the scope of that these texts had and reached, these are texts read by influencers, quote unquote, and opinion. And he has published this text once again as a mark by this professor stating that, well, not all the works are nonsense, useless, but perhaps yours is. And the image, the pictures, French cleaners who are workers who cannot stop. And also, there is a point in Professor Graeber's work that the pandemics makes clear that the more essential is a work, less money he is going. And that becomes broader in the pandemics, and we have an article about workers in the healthcare sector. And now let me hurry up. Another debate that emerges here is who is providing these essential services. It is
assim, outros temas que aparecem nas discussões de trabalho é automação,
automation. Those who follow these transformations in the work, it is undeniable that has been an automation increase. It's unavoidable to compare of what has really happened. We've had companies from all kinds in very difficult situations. We've had large corporations based on data and technologies, Alpha, that controls Google, Facebook, Microsoft, increase their domains during the pandemics. It's very good for these companies, but not so much for the work market in general. We have an increase in unemployment, and we have packages and tendencies of health transference, and workers that are prevented from working in the informal market that need some type of help in order to survive. Unemployment is a theme that has already emerged, but it's been part of the traditional world. Please, next. And it's fundamental to observe the debates about the space that is gained in the media. We've had an increase all over the world. Large portions of the world has had increase in these programs, and there's been evinced about as a model that may be utilized more permanently in this post-COVID world. I think I have finished, and in my conclusion, first, the graphic project is very beautiful for this text that Deborah Diniz has written, but she is going to reflect about the values that we may have in pandemic world with more feminist works. For those is this sector that and it's fundamentally work that is realized by women. So this is a theme that emerges with the strength in terms of preliminary data. Would you like to complement and close? Thank you, Chris. I'm only going to make one comment. In our expectations, again, I think that we need to refute these notions of futurology. Now we've had an exploration according to how these things, as we raise the data, we explore the themes and we deepen some of them. But in this research, we may assert 4 other themes that are more debated. And then we brought here exploratory research using our own materials with the research that is already wrapped up, and thinking that beyond this aspect, and fun to imagine these bubbles that are going to, the echo bubble that is going, we are using to travel during our vacation. And there's a point in which we talk about interventions in terms of where the debate is going, particularly in countries and hegemonic institutions. Some changes are going to happen. They are already occurring, and we know that these changes occur over history in very in different ways, and this is always small changes. It doesn't mean that everybody's going to stop hugging. You know, offices are going to be organized in a particular way, but in England, in post-lockdown, after 1 year of lockdown, many changes. Then we may realize that we stated that people were going to work more or less at home, and that people were going to, many things happen. They're having the opposite effect. People are desperate to go to their offices and to be in the streets, and all of that is to be observed. What are the intervention lines and markets that are being disputed, and everything that we have stated here, this body changes in the ways in which leisure and pleasure and distraction and work, all of these things that we are talking about, particularly in terms of new markets and companies of technology that raise and emerge in terms of a wedding over Zoom. There are companies, there are specialized to organize weddings with the march and the whole process online. So these are the new markets that emerge. We are not talking about cultural changes in a void. They have changes that are accelerated in the pandemics. Issues, for example, in terms of biotechnology, but what we have tried to place here in our presentation is how much we see, to a great extent, a process of exacerbation of inequalities, both for consumption work. We are not going to go into the debate if we should be talking about the work of consumption, but both in the work of word, what is essential work, who may stop and who may not, who are the racialized groups, what are the gender of these people who may and may not stop, who may travel in motorhome and who may not, who may not even travel, and how much this is going to reinforce ways of inequalities, specifically in distinctions, class distinctions that reinforce social inequality patterns. On one hand, we're here in a process after 1 year of lockdown. We've seen many stores that are closed in London. I haven't been there yet, but a colleague of mine, an anthropologist, stated that I have informs explaining that how many stores were shut down, but how many have been occupied in terms of these big stores, how they are opening up in terms of natural and organic foods, fair trade, and this natural consumption of more natural experience geared towards fair trade. But only part of the population may pay for these services. And many, as you can see, all of these restaurants, people are ringing my bell in the post-pandemic world is then when we work and we answer the door. Once again, thank you. I would like to listen to you.
depois eu fico pouco mais, mas quero agradecer
I would like to thank you very much.
E espero continuar aí a conversa.
Eu só quero avisar que teremos uma
I
pequena
would like to
hidráulicas de poucos minutos, 3 minutos para começar as perguntas. A Raquel necessita, como todo mundo.
Obrigado, professor Lívia, pelo lembrete. Eu quero agradecer.
We are going to have a 5-minute break for water and etc. So it's a 5-minute break.
Que vai debater as falas trazidas e após o professor vamos dar uma breve pausa de 5 minutos para a gente tomar uma água, se reorganizar e partir para o debate, ok? Vou apresentar o professor Dr. EnocentMsindo, que é professor associado de História. Ele é pesquisador avaliador pela National Research Foundation. Ele tem amplos interesses de pesquisa na história social e política de África. Ao longo dos anos, pesquisou e publicou sobre identidades sociais e políticas como etnia, nacionalismo, chefia e também sobre a marginalização no Zimbábue pré-colonial, colonial e pós-colonial. Recentemente, ele concluiu trabalho importante
Recently, he concluded a very important work in terms of his intercession about work in Zimbabwe, publishing his monography. Professor, you may open your camera now. Between 1860 and... So his book was published by Rochester University Press. Professor Msindo is a bachelor in history and philosophy, a master in history, and a PhD also from Cambridge. And he's been developing research and postdoctoral work. And Professor Msindo is also interested in studies of the history of media, propaganda and politics, and the architecture of public information. He's currently researching the politics of information in colonial Zimbabwe, in post-colonial Zimbabwe. And he's a meticulous worker who believes in reading solid archives in order to build field work in opposition and with an approach, always interdisciplinary approach, in order to locate these historical periods in territories in Africa and its community. I thank you for being here, Professor Msindo.
Yes, thank you so much for the introduction.
Agradeço por sua...
which is very much well appreciated indeed. It was a privilege to listen to Rosana and Christina giving us what appears to be kind of prophetic insights, if I can use that term. In other words, they are trying to think very hard about what could be the potential in relation to the future after the pandemic. It is very hard, obviously, to think about an event that is still unfolding and then think about its futures. So this is underlines how difficult a task they are actually undertaking. I'm delighted, colleagues, to note that they really gave very wide-ranging possibilities in so many areas, for which I am very deeply, deeply thankful. I really want to appreciate, in fact, the way they began by theorizing and developing such very strong hypotheses around the subject of futurology, with reflections on issues of discourse as power, and the narratives that emerge out of the manner in which predominantly male persons are engaged or engaging and thinking about the future. In fact, this is where the danger of the society is in, that the majority of the underdogs and the majority of women who are silenced in our existing discourses will have to, colleagues, bear the brunt of plans and the new orders that will be put by some of these men, particularly those billionaires who are in charge of moving the globe towards a very deeply super capitalist environment, which is extremely, extremely scary. My learned colleagues here, Rosana and Christina, did speak about the implications of the kinds of changes that have been brought by coronavirus upon society today, and the ways in which those kinds of changes are actually touching societies in terms of our ideas of everyday cultures, our ideas in terms of what constitutes the public and the private sphere, and how those could be instanced and negotiated in a context of rapid change that has been brought by the coronavirus itself. So they reflected very strongly on the work of Pierre Bourdieu, who does talk about class, habitus, and inequality. They also reflected on the work of Norbert Elias about the impact of social distance in the bodies as a construct of modernity, so to speak. So there were very strong reflections, ladies and gentlemen, on the impact of these on the mind, body, and work. Now, they did ask a very critical question here. How will the rituals of passage that we are used to happen without social gathering? Will they be body changes and emotional changes? Perhaps these are happening. How are we going to salute each other, and what would that mean in different cultural contexts? If I greet you with an elbow, what exactly is that conveying? Are you trying to block yourself from me? Or what exactly, are we in a fight? Or what are we doing? I think they're asking those kinds of very critical questions and what they imply for our cultures today. Now, the question I want to ask the presenters in relation to this is whether these body changes and rituals will be sustained at all, or is it just a temporary change for the moment? I also want to ask whether there will be, or whether there has been a revolt at all, or a protest in terms of whether people would like to greet themselves with an elbow or not, or whether people will agree to stick to new cultures that are being enforced and dictated upon them. I would like to suggest from an experience, colleagues, I had huge problems in April, where I lost a brother of mine who just comes after myself. And then some days later, about 14 days, his wife also died of cancer. That was in April. All that happened in April. And so now when I went to the funeral of my brother, I saw people that were keen to bring in their handshake to me, because it's a cultural practice that you greet someone and you go to shake hands. It has that kind of a meaning that speaks directly to your soul, and that kind of intimacy that make one feel that you are received and someone is crying or mourning together with you. So I faced a dilemma there when I then encountered people that felt uncomfortable with the notion of distancing. Because in rural spaces, some of the infodemic, and I mean the communication around issues of the epidemics and the implications of social distancing, the message reaches there, but it's not really well appreciated because of very strong cultural settings in which we belong to. Are we therefore witnessing a kind of greater exaggeration or continuity of greater divide between urban cultures and rural cultures? What is it that has happened in the same spaces that make people in town much more paranoid and much more careful than those who are in the rural spaces? So you did talk about the presentation of the self in the public sphere and in the private spheres and so on. You thought audaciously about the possibility of the end of suits. And I hope that Italy will forgive you because they are the major manufacturers of these nice suits that are all over this place. And I hope that you'll be forgiven for that. Now, the question is, colleagues, what lessons could be learned in terms of thinking about the future? What lessons can we learn from the Spanish influenza that happened almost 100 years ago? And how could those kinds of lessons help us to think predictively, perhaps, about the potentials for the human futures now? I mean, what I'm trying to point at is then that there is need for some kind of engagement with the past, with a view of trying to find out what it is we could derive from that very past that was before us. And then what possibilities of looking at the future we can talk about. Christina, you spoke very, very clearly about the future of work, which I think is very important, but at the same time, a very scary and touchy subject, so to speak. Because as I speak, I'm sitting somewhere in my workspace, and I don't know what it means to be told that at some point a robot is going to teach my students. It's completely scary. So essentially, the questions and debates about work and the future of work, obviously, Christina, these debates started well before COVID. I would like to just state one of my experiences in 2018 when I was doing some researches in London, in the United Kingdom. I was invited, my colleagues, to the Chatham House. And when I was at the Chatham House in England, in London, one of the gentlemen was talking about the issue of the robot revolution. And he did indicate, in fact, that most of the countries in Europe had a generally lower robot penetration per square kilometer than Asia, particularly than China. I wonder, from your own reflections, maybe, I know you are at the University of Bath, you probably could be encountering such kinds of debates in England and so on. From your own point of view, what is exactly the reason? I was surprised because I expected that there would be more robot penetration in Europe and more than it is in Asia. But now my thinking is perhaps Africa and Asia might end up being forced to have more robots because that's where most of the productive primary and secondary industries are based. And we are obviously the recipients of pollution that emerge out of those industrial spaces. And at the same time, we will be the recipients of the age of mechatronics, because what matters is not about human welfare, but what matters is about how much could be produced for the capitalist world. So having enjoyed your presentation, I think there are all those quibbling questions that emerge and comments that emerge out of it. Colleagues, there are general questions that also could be asked to aid on to very, very, very beautiful work that my two colleagues have illuminated here. How, what kind of economies are we going to think about, and what national spending cultures are going to persist and exist beyond this? We saw during the pandemic the emergence of a super president and super presidents across the globe, commanding everyone and reshifting the budgets of countries and shifting money to coronavirus care. What kinds of spending politics are we going to have beyond now? What are the possibilities for the state in its exercise of power? What political lessons have been learned about the relations between the state and the citizens, and the future of democracy in the context in which a president can come on the TV and says everyone is locked down, you are not going to travel anywhere? Imagine what should be and what will be the role of media in the whole arena of manufacturing consent. And what is it we could see in terms of the resilience of counterpublics? How and what kind of counterpublics will emerge, especially in an atmosphere of fear and paranoia and global propaganda? So the other critical question that emerges would be in terms of Africa and the pharmaceutical world. We saw that there was, I will use this perhaps inappropriate word in a different culture, there was a poo-pooing of the so-called COVID organics from Madagascar. Everyone was like, no ways, this is rubbish, don't talk about it. Everyone spoke against Madagascar's so-called COVID organics. And colleagues, I must confess, I held a colloquium a few weeks ago at Rhodes University, where I'm sitting right now. And I invited the head of the Africa Union Center for Disease Control. He was here. I invited the former head of the coronavirus task team in South Africa, seasoned epidemiologists, seasoned virologists, and the Center for Disease Control in Nigeria and other experts. And one of these remarks that came when we asked about indigenous knowledge systems and the issue of pharmacare, one of the virologists said, I have no time to talk about that Madagascar concoction. Did you hear me? Madagascar concoction. Now, the question I want to ask is, what is the future of Africa and pharmaceutical world? What are the possibilities for alternative medicine, considering that Africa itself is on the back foot in relation to the kind of preparations for these epidemics and so on? And another traumatizing questions that I don't expect anyone to answer at this particular moment are whether we have alternative research processes and what are the implications for research, especially fieldwork intensive disciplines like anthropology, like history, and some of us who like to be in the field talking to people. What are we going to be able to do? What is the future of physical conferences even in the light of Zoom? Are we going to have budgets in the university coffers to allow me to go to a conference? They will say, no, your conference is on Zoom. Can you justify why you cannot be on Zoom? I'm scared to think about those possibilities, colleagues, but I think you are right to say the kind of socializations that we are being guided into, we are trading on danger. We must prepare ourselves, Rosana and Christina, for a people's revolution against the authoritarianism of technology. Colleagues, I really want to rest my case at this point, and I want to really express my delight and appreciation for a very, very deep set of presentations that came out of you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor, for the brilliant questions that you bring to the discussion. Vamos agora ter uma breve pausa de 5 minutos, a pausa hidráulica, para a gente tomar uma água. E aí, após 5 minutos, retornamos às 11h51 em ponto, porque...
So we're going to have a 5-minute break for water. And since she has, and we then, after 5 minutes, we'll go back for the Q&A.
Welcome back, everybody.
Olá, pessoal.
Bem-vindos a todos de volta.
Bem-vindos de volta. Aproveitamos essa pausa para uma água. Tivemos grandíssimas questões para serem aqui pensadas juntos por todos nós. Eu vou...
Seu microfone, William. Microfone.
Alô, pessoal? Olá, estamos aqui de volta. Tivemos essa pausa de 5 minutos para tomar uma água. E agora estamos aqui para pensar essas questões que foram trazidas tanto pelo professor, a partir do trabalho das professoras. Eu vou passar a palavra agora para a professora Rosana, para ela dar início ao debate, e após a professora Cristina segue, e seguiremos trazendo também as questões da caixinha de perguntas.
So Professor Rosana and Christina are now going to address your questions. Thank you, Professor Msindo, for presenting such great questions. Thank you. Your questions were very provoking and inspiring, and I think it leads us to thank Chris and I have been working on this for 1 year. We always think as social scientists and academics, we are thinking in some way or another. The first thing that you place here is thinking about these inequalities that are being placed here in the post-pandemic world, in previous, prior to the pandemic world, how they become even more pressing differently, that the world was going to become a communist world. So many of these predictions in that sense, and what we see on the other hand is that we don't believe that the world is going to end with suits and Crocs shoes. But we see that there are companies imposing this notion of what will and will not be, and if the population is or is not going to purchase things. But the imposition from these markets, these are markets of shaped and marked by inequalities, accentuating inequalities, because this is a debate for a small number of a small portion of the population. My last slide, the services that do not stop. We also see one of the things that we wanted to debate, bringing a little bit of, I think it's important to dispute this future. We know that that discourses are practices and power relations, and therefore they should be resisted. And we talked very little about that. And on the opposite, we have then apparently this opportunity for the world to be feminist. I remember that it is important to dispute in this feminist future and this clear perception that it's necessary to dispute these futures, but also something I was talking to Chris about, who has time anyway, since the 19th century, time has become one, who has time to dispute the future and stay home in a triple journey, oftentimes with a trajectory that is extremely overburdening. It's necessary to dispute the future, and we know this battle is a narrative in which there's time and space, and the pandemics then provide more disputes. I enjoyed the examples that you bring about the bodies and the funeral. And this is at the core of what we want to debate, because what we're stating here, these are the countries. What are the countries that are telling us to greet each other with our elbows? Where has this exacerbated modernity been imposed, and where can it not be expressed? I'm not only talking about countries in the north, but amongst different classes in the global south, the differences among classes in urban Brazil, in closed condominiums, or in a peripheral community. The body relationships are going to be very different. And of course, we may need exactly in terms of geographical nuances. The world that is individualized is the same world that's been individualizing for a long time. So it's not going to be. So I embrace because it's my culture, but I may also be contracting the virus. How do we deal with this rethinking of our own bodies from a pandemic sanitary perspective? And I think that a part of this process is marked by many contradictions. And for example, hegemonic issues defending science as though it is well concluded in terms of showing and stating that science is not the only truth, and growing authoritative forces and negationism, so to speak. Being in a contradictory position because many of these processes that we have realized that are important, so these are the contradictions of this process. The role of the state. I wanted to talk a little bit about these windows of opportunity that pandemics open, because we haven't talked about that, but the majority of what we realize here is exactly defending now the importance of institutional intervention, state intervention in this, rather state support. So this then becomes a transversal theme in the narrative, hegemonic narratives for great international organizations. I could spend a lot of time speaking, but these are the contradictions I wish we could have. It's the dialectic of the synthesis that I hope we can then organize. I hope we can go back to hugging each other personally in our conferences. And about all of these important issues, once again, I thank you for your comments. I would also like to thank you for your comments. It's a great pleasure, and it's a joy to develop this research that is in a preliminary stage. to gain body from new perspectives and coming from such qualified perspectives. And the issues that have been presented here are very complex, are of incredible complexity. And how can I have answers for questions such as the body changes, are they permanent? We don't know, but we know that we have tried these different body relationships and potentially it has impacts over us. And I believe that it's also interesting to bring, in order to have another layer of complexity, an issue that we haven't talked about enough, which is this generational difference. I have a son who's 8 years old, and there is a generation of people who are raised in a context that is very different from ours. So what are going to be the impacts of that in 5, 10 years from now? We know. I would like to thank immensely, particularly in terms of rites of passage and talking about funerals, and in terms of the work itself. I'm not able to answer why we have more robotic interventions in certain parts of the world than in others. There are a number of variables to be considered. But what kind of robotization are we talking about? Because these automation processes seem to be, based on the conversations and classes I've had about this topic, they are immediately translated as an interpretation of robot that does something and replaces people. It's this physical machine that in the process of automation is much more profound and more disseminated than that. And then the way I provoke here is how do we think about a world in which these processes may be utilized by us in ways that are productive for society. I am not afraid of I am afraid of a robot doing the work that I do, but to provide you with a concrete example, I had to produce 40 certificates, and there is a program that does that. I download a certificate in a template, and it does it on my behalf. And I didn't want to sit for 3 hours producing a certificate. On the other hand, it saddens me and it scares me that perhaps we will no longer have funding to have face-to-face interactions, because I know that our conversations would be different if we were sitting around a table, drinking beer, things would be different. I know this relationship may not be replaced, but the question that I ask myself is how technology is used in our favor. And very frequently I place myself in a space of disagreement when I debate robotization and automation, because I think that our discussions are still a little bit binary and naive. What are we talking about in automation and robotization? How many problems is it not going to resolve? And of course, it's true that it seems that we are losing important battles. We have rights that are being taken away, wealth concentration, unemployment, process of exclusion that are being promoted through technology. What should we do in order to reverse this scenario? we may then talk about that in terms of the research that we develop. I think I have addressed from the issue that was presented in terms of automation. I also wanted to talk quickly. I know there are some questions. I see the boxes popping. But I wanted to talk about the implications for research, particularly for ethnographic research. As anthropologists, it's interesting that when we had, in the beginning of the pandemics, I was already in a process of revising an article in which I talked about digital platforms for ethnographic research. I had a research amongst photographers of rituals that take place personally, in person, and it's never been a choice per se to have Facebook research and Instagram using social networks. But I had to do that in light of the relationship of my interlocutors in terms of how it integrates in our lives and in their lives. The internet was a space for sociability and learning and for disputing markets. There were several interactions that went through the internet. So at the same time that I think we may not be naive to think that it may be replaced and our relationship is of the same nature online and presential, I don't think that's the case. There's also a need for us to change, for a pragmatic change. Perhaps I may not like this world, but that's the way it's presented to me. Once again, opening to more issues for debate. Thank you again.
Acho que agora sou eu que trago as questões do site para vocês, não é isso?
I'll bring you now. I would like to, however, say goodbye. I have something else, an appointment. I have another urgent appointment at 4 p.m. my time. But I know that you're going to have the luxurious comments. And my presence is not going to make a difference here. I would like to thank you, Professor. I would like to thank Raquel for her translation, William. And I would like to thank Chris as well, William, the fabricadeideias, for inviting me. I'm going to copy all the questions, and then I'm going to debate with Chris, but you are in wonderful hands, and sorry, I have to leave. Send me the questions, please, William, later. Thank you.
Prazer imenso te ouvir. Tantos anos, né? Realmente sempre espetáculo. Bom, gente,
it's always wonderful to have the possibility of listening.
Passar para vocês as questões que estão sendo colocadas no site.
So before anything, I would like to thank you for the opportunity of disputing research by Rosana and Chris. I think I talked to Rosana a lot, and I've been following her research that is extremely important, and the impact of the Factory of Ideas is certainly going to be great. And I would like to state my joy in this book that I think in 2012 about the history in Zimbabwe. It's something that I'm very happy to see here with us in the Factory of Ideas. And I think that several issues are detached or evinced in terms of the unequal impacts of the pandemics, I think it would be one of the points that are being evinced. Rosana Castro is talking about the issue of what would be a world that could be healthier. The notion of healthy is distributed unequally in light of what's healthy or not. We have an issue of a group by Burkina Faso, Sinomanita, who states that a temporality, a difficulty that has been in Burkina Faso in terms of remote working, a number of limitations in terms of a prohibition of the internet, but it's also, he evinces a little bit of this dilemma that once people become used to remote working, they could opt to continue to do that work and staying in their own familiar universe. And Livio also places a number of questions in terms of aspects. Every time we have positive aspects and negative aspects of this post-pandemic world, and the potentialization of movements to the left or to the right in this post-pandemic world. And he invites us to think about whether we are not meeting again with this debate around the notions of globalization that have divided social sciences amongst globalists and progressists and observers. I think that this point that Livio is evincing is particularly important, in which not only do we have the restructuring of certain elements that are a part of our history, how the pandemics then have relived debates that we have already had in terms of the AIDS epidemic, in particular case, the meningitis epidemic in the 70s, or the Grand Fronton. And we started to talk about the Spanish flu. We are looking at what's been mobilized in history. I think that this is an interesting point to events. And also Livio is asking that it's interesting to think about social distancing as a principle of bourgeoisie life, and that this emergence of new etiquettes. And I remember that not only the text by Elias, but the inspiration of what's been imposed in terms of body techniques. And Mose detaches these changes, behavioral changes in the space of a generation, in terms of physical interventions in the space of a generation. In 33, 34, and Cristina rather, talks about what are the epistemological limits of the solutions of unnecessary work, and what could we think about in terms of an analysis about the post-pandemic world as a defense collective mechanisms vis-a-vis insecurities that plague us at the moment? How were we able to reinvent during the pandemics? How were we able to bring this research data? I think it's an issue of how you have developed this research. Question for Chris: what is your perception about the increase of the work through platforms as the pandemic effect, so that we may enable the possibility of more processes of precarization of work. And finally, a question that I'm grabbing here from, this is a new experience for me, grabbing questions through chat boxes. But I have another question here about how the current crisis and their impacts in Africa and Latin America reveals neo-colonialist heritage that is more alive than ever. I think it's a universe of extraordinary questions that Chris may react to. Innocent, would you like to address the questions first? Please, you start, and then Innocent. Thank you for this difficult task of gathering up questions. I know that it's being broadcast on YouTube, and we are here in Zoom as well. I trusted you in this task, and I then got lost. So I understand, and I thank you for having done that. Of course, I took some quick notes, and I'm going to start by the issue raised by Carolina, being aware of the dangers, because these are very dear themes to me. So does it enable precarization or not? I think I'm very thankful for these questions. It brings to at the same time, the concern of the work in terms of the work of precarization, it also allows for regulation politics. One thing should happen is that what I'm focusing on is defending a little bit what kind of platform, work via platform are we talking about, because some are more visible to us and are being more debated both in traditional media as well as in academia. So the work in platforms for drivers and people who work with delivery. On the other hand, they have migrated to platforms a number of other activities. So through small companies that have never used platforms, start using these platforms. Currently, I'm writing an article about photographers that have been extremely impacted by the pandemics, since weddings have been, and parties and festivities have been shut down. But there's been an extreme reduction in the demands for these photographers, and a large part of the work that they do is through platforms. They have these audiences in platforms and portfolios, and they promote work. So this is a time and an energy that is dedicated to platforms. And however, they are not immediately recognized as workers. They do not correspond to this classic model. So in order to understand this, it's necessary to broaden this perspective, because perhaps this might be a process that is even broader than we think more immediately. And studying an example of this, this is a theme that has emerged in reports the issue of the industry of workers, sex workers. Is it going to be the end of prostitution? This was a theme that generated a lot of debate. I cannot remember anymore. And also, it's an issue that is fundamental, which is
quem sou eu? Ou seria muito chato eu andar por aí dizendo se o trabalho é necessário, se não é, se é necessário, se é fundamental, quer dizer, não.
It's necessary, it's fundamental, because who can have this distinction? And the answer that was provided is that workers themselves, if workers understand that the activity that is developed by them the whole time, there's no value, even if it's symbolic, then we need to question this work. And the examples, for those who are not aware, there are smaller texts circulating. I think it's Push Jobs. And he mentions actually works that are very well paid, of financial analysts that work with the financial market, and people who state to others where they should invest their money in order to expand their wealth. So if this is the work that is disappears, perhaps this is going to have, we are going to have a better word, because these people are not going to be teaching others how to expand their wealth. The issue placed by Rosangela is fundamental. Who is who in this world that could be healthier? This is what we wonder all the time. Who can afford to be healthier, to prepare their own food, to plant their own vegetables? And another issue that was brought by issue regarding globalization, I think the comment is that this has been one of the most broadening categories, which is the debate about geopolitics. How do we debate national frontiers, and we rediscuss the nationalization of basic products? We are talking about distribution of vaccines at a moment when this research was developed, but this is still a current issue of great importance. And in conclusion, in fact, the text that we have included here in terms of body techniques was a text that we went back to. It's interesting to see how a classic is a classic, and this text is incredible. I do recommend this. It's reading it, and it's worth to read it again during this pandemic, because it has brought many insights.
É isso, gente. Mais uma vez, muito obrigada, Omar. Muito obrigada pelos comentários. E agora eu gostaria de ouvir o professor Enocent.
I would like to listen now to Professor EnocentMsindo.
Yeah, thank you, colleagues. I'm in between trying to translate some of the questions that have been asked. And so please forgive me if I will not get it right. Okay. I will respond in very, very brief terms. There was a question about how much does the current pandemic crisis and its impacts on Africa and Latin America reveal to us about that the neo-colonialist heritage is more alive than ever? Well, the issue of coronavirus and the crisis itself that it brings is just a reflection, colleagues, about the nature of the neo-colonial world we are in, particularly the controls that it brings and it brought. Right at the beginning, there have been massive debates about the origins of this virus, with lots of people talking about this being something, some experiment that went wrong in China and some things spilled into the public spaces and so on and so on. All that we shouldn't be even spending time discussing what caused it. But what we should appreciate is the fact that whatever the cause was, the neo-colonial world itself has been ready and is ready to dictate its terms upon those that are underprivileged, who are in the main going to remain perpetual victims of the kind of global processes that happen from pharmaceutical industries, from the nature of work, and from quite a lot of things. So we are talking here about a reorganization of the world on the basis of leaning on this pandemic. But the reorganization itself, Africa is not directly involved in the conversations about what Africa and Brazil and the rest of Latin America, they don't know what kind of futures will be reorganized for them. It is a pity, colleagues, that we have a kind of political leadership that have become surrogates of the international world order and its dictatorial tendencies. Obviously, because the weakness of our political systems is money. If you can give them money, if you can cause them to do certain things for their populations, they will be happy to accept it without consequence, without thinking about the consequences on the people. So it's just whatever has happened is just going to extend and consolidate the neo-colonial system. There was a question around the fact that there were positives and negatives right and left in the analysis of the post-pandemic world. As it was, I read it, when we were confronted with the notion of globalization, which divided the social scientists into globalists and anti-globalist, progressive and conservatives. Do you agree? I would agree. It depends on who are the beneficiaries of the positives of this virus. I haven't seen, and I'm yet to see perhaps how our continent of Africa and the greater part of the global South is going to benefit from this. The recipients of poverty, the recipients of suffering, the recipients of pauperism have always been known since the time the time of the slave trade up to now. We are in a global order that we will find challenges escaping. If we try to escape it, I will guarantee you that there are going to be wars all over the space. You know, those who are familiar with the historical studies, you will know about rising figures that emerged in the 1960s and 70s all across Africa, all across parts of what is called Latin America, and what has happened to them. They've been demonized, they've been scandalized, some of them have been killed under circumstances where they were trying to bring reform to their countries and so on. And so the picture is not all that rosy, and I don't want to pretend that Africa will be able and is able to solve the kind of challenges of its space in the global order. So we remain, from my view, pessimistic about the notion of globalization and what its impact on the continent would be. Our colleagues That is my personal view, so to speak. I may want to familiarize myself with some of the questions if I can translate them. But I will stop at the moment and share further. Thank you.
Muito
Você
obrigado.
assume, William.
Obrigado, professor Omar, pela gentileza do auxílio e da compilação de questões.
Thank you, Professor Omar, for helping with these questions. We are reaching our limit because online we have different timing. We could go on and on here if we were doing this in person, but unfortunately we have a 2.5-hour limit. I would like to thank the Factory of Ideas and the whole team, Professor Cristina Marin, Professor Rosana, Professor Innocent for his brilliant contribution and his rich questions for the continuity of the thinking about this moment where we live and what's about to come. I would like to thank the whole team, for Raquel for her translation, and to all of those who have helped us. Thank you for the list is opened, and we are going to have our certification, and next week, Tuesday, we are going to have a team of professors who specialize in issues of gender, the transnational perspectives on gender during the pandemics. Once again, I would like to thank my team. Have a wonderful afternoon, and thank you. Thank you, William. Chris.